To start this evening. Very happy that you're all here. Good to be with you tonight. Good to be getting back into our study. We've been away for a week because we had Brother Holloway with us last week. Enjoyed his time among us, but I've also been anxious to get back into our regular studies. We're in Genesis chapter 30 tonight, as it was mentioned on the screen. Actually, we're picking up about halfway through that chapter. We'll be starting in verse 25 this evening with mostly new material. So go ahead and have your Bibles open, please. Genesis 30 and verse 25. Before we get into anything too heavy, let's begin with a prayer. If you would, bow with me, please. Let's go to God. Holy Father, we give you thanks for this day that you've blessed us with, all the good that you have brought with it. We're grateful that we can be called your children and that we can truly know you. We thank you for your goodness towards us, your power displayed in so many ways, your abiding love, and the salvation that we can have through Christ. We're grateful for his example, and especially for the sacrifice that he made on our behalf. We give you thanks for the safety that you've given to us in allowing us to come here in the first place, and the peace of mind that we can enjoy being in this place with those who love you and those who have faith. We pray that we'd be strengthened and encouraged by our time here together. We ask your blessing as we look at your word together and hope that we will gain much from it as we look at those who have come before, as we see faith in action, as we see your power in bringing about your promises. Please help us tonight to worship well and sincerely. Be with us as we study together. We offer this prayer in Christ's name. Amen. All right, in Genesis chapter 30, we're really beginning at the end of chapter 29. We saw the beginning of Jacob's family. And as we noted at the time, this was when Jacob first left home, when he's on the run from Esau. There's a lot of uncertainty surrounding that, but God appeared to him in that great vision at Bethel, and that was a key component to how God comforted him in that instance. You're going to have numerous descendants. He follows up with everything he had said to Abraham, everything that he had said to Isaac, the same promise now made to Jacob, that he would be the father of a large people, and that they would be blessed, that he would be protected. Well, now we're starting to see that come to fruition in chapter 29 into 30. By the end of the section we left off with, by verse 24, the family is very large. They've grown considerably. Jacob has 2 wives, and through 4 women has these 12 children, 11 sons and 1 daughter. So the family is almost completed. We know that there is one more baby boy who will be coming along shortly in Benjamin. But we saw that kind of exponential growth that we've been maybe anticipating and expecting with this family, because up to now it's only been through difficulty that they've reproduced. But now Jacob is really, his family is really starting to take off. So that's essentially where we left off. There was difficulty at the beginning, of course, because Jacob has been having to undertake all of this through the agency of his father-in-law, Laban, who is a bit of a snake, and there's been some disagreements, there's been some deception already, and nonetheless, the family has begun to grow, and so we find ourselves in verse 25. Time has passed, and Jacob is maybe ready for the next chapter to start being written, and we will see exactly how that unfolds, beginning here in verse 25 together. I'm trying tonight to cover a fairly lengthy section of the text. I would like to finish chapter 31, which, if you're looking ahead, you see it's 55 verses, and you're thinking you know me and that I must be crazy. But it may not happen. We'll just see. My point is, we aren't going to be looking at each of these verses and passages in minute detail. A lot of them, I think, we can safely treat with a bit of an overview treatment. And still get the main point and still be able to follow what we're meant to take away from them. It's not in any way to say they're not important. You understand what I'm saying. But beginning in verse 25, we have the first of these sections. As we've mentioned, time has passed. You've got about 14 years now that have gone by. Jacob will say later on in this section we're looking at tonight, he will tell Laban that they've been together for 20 years. And, it's difficult to know exactly when X event would have happened and when Y event would have happened within that 20 years. But he spends 2 decades ultimately away from his ancestral home and his promised home, away from his immediate family that he had grown up with, his parents, his brother, and it's going to be that kind of 20-year sojourn for Jacob while he is away, and this seems to be happening about 14 years into that, actually. Could be that Jacob is legitimately ready to go home when he comes to Laban and says, "Send me away that I may go to my own place, to my own country. Give me my wives and my children for whom I've served you, and let me go, for you know my service which I have done for you." Any other options in why Jacob is coming to Laban to bring this up, if not just actually ready to leave? Knowing what we know of Jacob, I think this could just be a nice prelude into a kind of negotiation. He's going to try to do that from a position of advantage or leverage. It's kind of the way when you're buying a car, you don't just go tell the salesman, "All right, I want this one. What does it cost? Tell me what I got to pay you to get this one." No, you're going to tell him, "Well, I'm not sure. I don't know if I want this one. I haven't settled on it yet. And I don't know if I'm going to buy it here or if I'm going to buy it now," or, you're not just going to give away your whole hand. You're going to tell him, maybe you can convince me that this is the case. Especially with Jacob bringing up there in verse 26, "You know my service which I've done for you," is calling back to the fact that you know that you tricked me into 7 additional years of work that we did not agree to in the beginning. So you know how things have gone. Now I'm ready to leave. And that is going to open things up for Laban to say, "Well, name me your wages and I will give it." Almost with the sense of saying, "Tell me the price of you staying and we'll be able to meet that out." So it sounds like this is just sort of a prelude to, let's have a conversation about where things are, rather than Jacob just saying, "All right, it's time for me to leave." There's several allusions, both in chapter 30 and 31. Several times we will find an allusion to just how much both men had prospered from their agreement, and Jacob working with them. This kind of main flock that you see reference to. Verse 29, Jacob is going to mention that to Laban. "I've served you, how your livestock has been with me. What you had before I came was little, and it has increased to a great amount. The Lord has blessed you since my coming." This is an important point for what will follow, especially in chapter 31. It's important for us to see that when Jacob is accused of, stealing things from Laban's house, or he's accused of getting all the glory, or getting all the benefit from any work that he had done, and that, Laban made him, and this kind of thing. These sorts of accusations will be made against Jacob later on. It's important for us to understand that's not true, first of all, and everyone knows. Laban knows that that's not the case. He knows that Jacob has been good to have around. This has benefited both of them. It's been a mutually useful arrangement having Jacob there. Why is it that things have gone well with Laban having Jacob around? Why has that been a good move for him? We just read it. Gary.
Well, as I see it, Laban had a meal ticket.
Yeah.
And that was Jacob.
Yeah.
You can say that in many ways. I happen to have a son-in-law like that. I know what that is.
Yeah.
And he's getting ready to lose this meal ticket. So this is going to be tough.
He didn't want that to happen. Why is Jacob such a good guy to have around, Wilson?
Verse 27.
Okay.
The last part of it. For I have learned by experience that the Lord has blessed me for your sake.
Yeah.
So Jacob was doing the work, and Laban was getting the setting all this up for future time.
Okay. Laban mentions it there in verse 27. Jacob mentions it in verse 30. The Lord has blessed you since my coming. Both of those exactly right. Laban doesn't want Jacob to leave because he's a good man to have around. Jacob is a good man to have around because the Lord is blessing him. He has made these promises to him. You're going to prosper. I'm going to be with you. I'm sheltering you, so forth. And we're seeing that come to pass. This is nothing new in the story. You go back to Abraham, and you're seeing these exact same things play out. Because what did God promise Abraham? Those who bless you, I'll bless them. And if they curse you, I'll curse them. I'm with you. I'm on your team. I'm on your side. Or maybe you'd phrase that the opposite way. But this is what happens with these people who bear God's blessing. Through you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. He's just setting up a principle here that will come true in the most full and perfect sense through Jesus Christ. We're talking about that on Sunday mornings. But even now, we're seeing the literal, more near-term payoff of that is that these men are a blessing to the world. They're a blessing to those around them. Not because of their innate goodness, not because Jacob is just so good with livestock, or just because they're so nice and wonderful to be around all the time, because God is blessing them, and his blessing means something. So, again, useful for us to understand that all the principal characters so far understand this. We're all on the same page in recognizing, I want Jacob here. Jacob is good to have here. I have benefited from him being here, because the story will shift a little bit in chapter 31 for whatever reason. I think because of human weakness. But so Laban will essentially tell Jacob what Jacob said the first time when Jacob wanted to marry Rachel. There was kind of an idea of, anything you want. He makes that extravagant offer. Now the shoe is on the other foot a little bit. They've had these 14 years for Laban to really understand what is what. And so he says, okay, you tell me what it is that you want. So what are the terms? What does Jacob ask for? If you had a chance to read ahead, or if you've been looking at it as we've been discussing, we see Jacob's plan beginning there in verse 31. It can be a little bit confusing, or it can sound a little bit strange maybe. What is it that Jacob offers? What's his idea that he puts forth as what his payment will be?
Let me have the culls out of the sheep, the animals. That's all it goes. Just give me the culls.
Okay, there's going to be, among both animals, it seems you've got sheep and goats primarily that you're dealing with, going to be some that are differently marked, differently colored. And, the terms that are used there may be a little bit ambiguous about what exactly he's talking about, but they're the ones that are differently colored, whatever they are. Black sheep, speckled goats, whatever it is. They're the ones that don't look like the others, the minority group, the recessive traits. You give me those animals, and then seems to go on to establish too, in verses 32 and 33, we'll just keep those separate. We'll kind of make a separate herd, and in perpetuity, the ones that continue to have those strange markings, I get those. Those will be my wages moving forward. So he's not really just asking for a one-time, give me a little flock of my own, but kind of for all of us, we'll just divide the animals up this way. If it's an animal that's the normal color you'd expect a sheep or a goat to be, you get it. If it ain't, then I get it. That seems, as I mentioned, those are both recessive traits. Those are the minority cases where you're going to have those animals. That seems like a good deal for Laban, especially the way it's all set up. They're going to be removing those animals from the main flock. And in fact, Laban, I think I have that mentioned on the screen, maybe in a moment, Laban is going to end up taking the extra step of, in verse 36, putting 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob. I don't know if he was suspicious or just being circumspect, I don't know, but he's saying we're going to keep these well away from each other and make sure that there's no commingling. So this is what you would anticipate as another good deal for Laban. He's going to somehow be able to come out on top of this. But that's not the way it ends up happening. We'll find in verse 37. I realize I'm having to skip ahead quite a bit. In verse 37, we'll start seeing how all of this pays off. But the removal has taken place there in verse 35. The flocks are totally separate. Jacob is left with just this kind of small group of animals that he's going to begin with. So what's the next step that he will take? Here's where things get maybe even more confusing or strange. Look at verse 37. He's going to take rods of green poplar and of the almond and chestnut trees, and then peel white strips in them, and expose the white which was in the rods. And then set those in the gutters, or in the ditches, in the watering areas, where the flocks came to drink, so that they should conceive when they came to drink. What's he doing here? What's going on? Okay, animal husbandry of some kind. He's got some idea in mind. This seems to be, as near as I can tell, and anything that I've read on it that is in any way convincing, what seems to be going on is that Jacob is kind of playing on the idea, or running with the idea, that has, I think, persisted for a long time after his time even, that what an animal sees while it's conceiving its offspring in some way imprints on the embryo, that there is a connection between what they are visualizing and what the offspring will end up looking like. It sounds odd to us, maybe sounds crazy to us, but it's been a long-standing belief that there is some connection between those two things. It definitely seems like that is what Jacob has in mind, because in both cases he's setting up something that will have stripes or that will have different colored markings next to each other, and he's putting those in the areas where the animals are going to be mating together. And that, that's explained down there in verses 38 and 39, that he wants them to be facing that way, looking at those things as that's going on. The other animals are going to be looking at spotted animals while they're reproducing. So that seems to be what he's aiming for, at least. Why is it actually going to end up having any effect? Wilson, before we go on.
Jacob knew, when you read this, you've got to understand the old ways and old symbols.
Yeah.
Thing. He knew exactly what kind of trees to get, how to peel them. It's green poplar and almond and chestnut trees. And he knew exactly which ones to get. And this could have been something that had been handed down over the years.
Yeah.
We don't know that just by reading, but it could have been.
Yeah.
Because he knew exactly what he was looking for when he went there to do it, and he knew exactly what would happen with it. It wasn't a guess, I guess this will work. He knew it would work.
This does seem, something about this practice seems to be like it was well understood at the time, or like, well, okay, that checks out. That makes sense that this is going to happen. Ron?
I think he also understood that God wanted not blemish anything. He wants the best, and that's ultimately the white sheep.
Okay. Could be, although in this case that really isn't what happens, is it? The opposite ends up taking place. He's going to get a lot of the speckled animals. And I think, I'll go ahead and mention there, definitely part of his plan is that he is taking, in verse 42, not putting in the feeble animals. He's using the stronger animals to reproduce through this method, and so he's ending up with stronger, spotted or black or whatever kind of animals he's looking for. That part does seem to be part of his plan or part of his understanding of the process. Especially when we get into chapter 31, Jacob himself will be very clear on why this works. And, he doesn't say anything about embryos. He doesn't say anything about, the science behind any of this or even the tradition behind any of this. His opinion, I think, is much more to the point. He is talking about the Lord was blessing me. It's the same thing that we just saw from Laban and Jacob discussing it. God wanted it to go this way. God saw fit to do this, and he has made me increase. I set up the terms. I did the things that I thought would work, but what really happened is God made my portion increase, and he made Laban's decrease. So as far as what was actually going on, how effective were any of those means that he was using, I don't know. I don't have any idea. That isn't really the point at all. The point is God wants Jacob to prosper, and so that's exactly what happened. I don't know if Jacob would have set up an amusement park and had them breeding there, if he would have set up a pink, little archway for them to walk through before they had their breeding. That probably would have worked too. I don't know that it would have mattered exactly what process was being followed. The key is simply that God was once again protecting him. I think I've mentioned there verse 7 of chapter 31 is where that explanation is really going to begin taking off. God didn't allow him to hurt me. God is going to be doing exactly what he promised. His protection is going to be found no matter what Jacob does. Comments, questions, anything up through the end of chapter 30. We see in verse 43 the summary of all of this. The man Jacob became exceedingly prosperous. He had large flocks, female and male servants, camels and donkeys. Could not be going better for Jacob. And although it did not seem the best arrangement when it was made, this one is working out in his favor because God is with him. Anything else to mention there? All right, getting into chapter 31 then. We were introduced earlier, back in the first part, or the kind of middle part of chapter 30, we were introduced to some of Laban's sons, which had not been mentioned in the story at all up to this point. And we've seen a lot of Laban's family going back into chapter 24, I guess. But he also has some sons, evidently, and we're reintroduced to them in chapter 31, that they are now saying, Jacob has taken away all that was our father's, and from what was our father's, he has acquired all this wealth. This is where I was talking about a minute ago. It's important for us to understand what was said earlier. This is not true. This is not the case. Jacob hasn't stolen anything from Laban. He has not defrauded Laban of anything. He has only led to Laban's increased wealth and increased prosperity. And now the arrangement that has made Jacob himself individually much more wealthy than he was is something that Laban agreed to, and it was negotiated in good faith. And I would imagine that Laban has not really lost out on any of this to begin with. He had his own flock over here that was animals that he agreed to take, and it was the lion's share of the herd, and they're probably still doing just fine. What's happening here is that these men don't like seeing Jacob do well. They don't like seeing him do probably better than they are doing, and amassing for himself more than what their fortune would be, more than what their inheritance would actually amount to. And so you've got that as really the key element, the key ingredient here that's causing tension between Jacob and Laban. The statement in verse 2, chapter 31, verse 2, Jacob saw the countenance of Laban. And it's literally saying there, his face. Sometimes that's obscured a little bit in the reading that says, Laban's disposition changed or something along that line. But he's literally saying there, you can even tell by looking at him. When we're sitting at the breakfast table before we go out there to take care of the animals, and I look across the table at my father-in-law, I can tell in his face he's not as happy with me as he used to be. There's something that has changed. And so there's tension. There's a little bit of stress between them. It was not favorable toward him as before. So what does Jacob do?
Calls his wife and says, okay, get everybody ready.
Okay. And as we'll see at many points in this narrative, just as we did with Abraham, it's a mixture, it's a combination of that, Jacob deciding, time to go, time to leave. He's able to read the signs. We probably shouldn't keep sticking around here with Laban, but what else also happens that especially prompts that particular decision in verse 2 or 3? Yeah, the Lord also is going to say to Jacob, return to the land of your fathers and to your family, and I'll be with you. With those two in combination, and really the order that they're presented in chapter 31, it's almost as though God is giving his approval to what Jacob was already feeling, or what he had perceived might be the right course of action. God is saying, yes, you're right, it is time to go. Go back home to your family, and I'll continue being with you. This is the right decision to make. That idea itself, return to the land of your fathers and your family, and I'll be with you, again, sounds very familiar to what we've already seen in Genesis numerous times. Go all the way back to chapter 12 when God first calls Abraham. Isn't it essentially that? Go to a place that I'll show you, and I'll be with you. You just go. That's all you got. The only thing you need to worry about in the world is traveling right now, and I'm going to take care of the rest of it. So you just go. And it's kind of the same here. God's promise at Bethel to Jacob himself in chapter 28 that we've mentioned numerous times. Very similar terms set up. Do the traveling, and I'm going to be with you. For that whole journey, this whole sojourn that you're on, you are under my protection. This also is going to reveal this general section here, going down to verse 21 or so. Jacob makes mention of Laban changing his wages, and that'll come up in their conversation too, and Laban doesn't dispute it, really, when Jacob makes that accusation. Jacob says, he changed my wages 10 times. I don't think he's speaking literally there, probably the way we'd say, he did this a dozen times, or 1,000 times this guy's done this to me. I don't know how many times it actually happened, but he does talk about Laban switching the terms, especially on this agreement that they had about what kind of animals do we get. Laban apparently reneged on some of those and said, no, now you get the brown ones. No, now you get the ones with blue eyes, or whatever it was. He keeps coming up with all these different arrangements, and Jacob seems to go along. He seems to acquiesce with all of those, maybe to keep the peace. I don't know what's going on, but here his complaint is he's been acting dishonestly. He keeps changing the agreement, and he's tired of that, and he's going to have that as a grievance against Laban that they'll air out personally very soon. But his argument all throughout that section is, I've been doing right. I've been acting honestly. I've been abiding by the terms of whatever arrangement he cooked up. And you know what? It doesn't seem to matter. It doesn't seem to matter what Laban decides will be my share and what will be his share. Mine always comes out on top. You can divide it up however you want. You can draw the contract up as many times as you want, but it didn't seem to matter how Laban wiggled and maneuvered and what he did to try to get the upper hand. God at this point was not allowing that to happen. Jacob had just continued to prosper, even though his father-in-law was trying to cheat him numerous times. So, as Wilson pointed out a minute ago, he's going to first of all take his family out into the fields. I don't know the specific point behind that, other than maybe to give them some privacy. These people are covering a lot of ground anyway, so I don't think they're all just holed up in a cabin during most days anyway, but maybe this seems less suspicious, I guess, if they're discussing this out in the fields. It was just an opportune time for him to get them out of the house, away from everyone else, and discuss this. And so he reveals his plan to leave. How do Rachel and Leah deal with this? They on board? Yes, no, why? Linda? Okay.
So, everything that we would have gotten from him, God has given to you.
Yeah. They can see the transference that has happened here He's already moved it from Camp A into Camp B, and so, Laban doesn't seem that interested in us to begin with, and we know we don't stand to gain anything materially by hanging around here. They can kind of see, just as Jacob has and just as Laban has, which way God wants this to go. Wilson?
From the very his first dealings with him proved that he was a crook to start with.
Yeah.
Because he deceived him on which daughter he was going to get.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they didn't. I mean, the girls had seen this all these years.
They know what their dad is like, and they can see from the very beginning of their dealings with Jacob how things were going to go. And if you think about just that whole arrangement to begin with, he's used them not just like he's marrying someone off. Anyone during this day, they're going to marry their daughter off. They're going to, in some way, I think it would be common at this time, in some way you're going to try to find some advantage with marrying off your children. You don't want to set them up for failure in life or whatever the case might be. But Laban has really taken that to an extreme. Their opinion that they voice here in this section, that he sold us. He sold us off. He hasn't treated us like daughters. He's treated us like slaves or like property. He's just been doing this so that he can profit. That's the only thing he was looking for when he was making those marital arrangements. How was he going to benefit from it? And again, if you think of how did all of this begin, he was just trying to get more work out of Jacob and tricked him in doing that. They understand the backstory of all of this. So they're resentful of that, evidently, and they agree to leave and are going to do so, kind of stealthily. They're going to sneak off, essentially. I don't want that fact to obscure, we've pointed out several times, the justice in Jacob's case, and don't let the sneaking away in this case, obscure that or change that in some way. Maybe you'd say, well, they should have told him. Should they have? I don't know. Maybe let the kids say goodbye to grandma or whatever's going on. But I think Jacob at this point has good reason to think he's going to come up with something else to try to get me to stay. He's going to, use force like he's going to threaten to do in just a little bit. Or he's going to try to keep back some stuff that does not rightly belong to him. He might change the agreement again in hindsight. This just seems the better option to him to say, he has not acted right. We don't have to continue living in this. We're going back home, and we're doing it right now. While he's out sheep shearing, that always biblically is kind of a big production, it seems. It's a big festival time. Maybe it happens somewhere else and is going to just consume a lot of manpower and so forth. So while he's busy, while he's occupied with that, we're just going to leave. Again, whether or not that's right, and I don't really see a big problem with it to begin with, but the point of all of this is Jacob is in the right and Laban is not. And we'll see that validated as we go forward. One other event does happen before we leave, though, and it'll come into play a little bit later. In verse 19, Rachel stole the teraphim, is the Hebrew word there. Household idols is typically how that's translated, although we don't know the exact meaning of that word, but they are some kind of little statuary, little items of some type that seem to have some religious connotation. Gary?
This is a signal moment right here, because prior to this, all of Isaac's family worshiped one God.
Mm-hmm.
And when this group gets down to Canaan, well, here's these little gods.
Yeah.
Now, that don't mean to say that there weren't little gods already in Canaan, but
Right.
now they're introduced into God's people, and that is a signal.
It could be, and they're definitely inundated with that from the people that they live among in Canaan. It's probably not new to their experience to see that. This is the first time going back to at least Abraham that we've seen it within the family, isn't it? Not a lot ends up being made of this later on from a spiritual perspective. It will be part of, I think, some satire in chapter 31 when Laban is trying to find them, but not a lot is made of this as being a strongly negative thing, a strike against them. Maybe you would look into this and see, I don't know, some judgment against Rachel who's going to die in childbirth very soon. I don't know. That feels like a bit of a stretch to me. There could be a simpler, more mundane explanation in verse 19 for what she's doing in taking those household idols. A lot of records that we've seen, tablets that we've discovered from around this time, make a connection between household shrines or idols, religious paraphernalia, and inheritance. And so it could be her taking what would be almost a token of inheritance that she feels she is still due, that she feels she is still entitled to, and is taking that along with her, because all the discussion leading up to this has been around that idea of inheritance, what belongs to us, what is rightly ours, what our dad has been trying to cheat us out of. It would make sense in that context for her to say, you know what, just to be sure, I'm taking these with me. And that'll maybe clear up any confusion that there could be later on. I'm making sure that these stay with our property. That could be what's going on here. Or again, it could be something of more spiritual merit, or more spiritual difficulty, really. But that's just difficult to say. Anyway, for now, file away the fact that Rachel does this and Jacob does not know that she has, evidently. All right, comments, questions up through verse 21 or so. All right. See, I'm moving kind of fast. We can do this. We can do it. Don't talk that. Didn't sound confident at all. You might. All right, verse 22, Laban is going to be in hot pursuit. They had a 3-day head start, Jacob and family did, but it's a big company, right? We've been told numerous times already how profitable he's been and how successful he's been with amassing all these huge amounts of livestock. And you've got babies and you've got, they're moving slowly. So they get a 3-day head start, but Laban is able to catch them in about a week. They go a 7 days journey, and they're able to catch them in the mountains or in the high country at least. We maybe wouldn't consider them mountains from our perspective, but they're out there in the hill country. Laban is going to have a dream of his own. Here again, echoes of previous narratives. This is what has happened with every generation now. Abraham and Isaac and Jacob have gotten into some kind of trouble where God has to appear to someone else and say, stay back, hands off, you guys need to watch yourself. This is my guy, and I don't want you doing anything to him. And that's what he's going to do in coming to Laban and saying, don't say anything to Jacob, whether for good or evil. Now, we will note that Laban ends up violating this, really. He is going to give Jacob a talking to, so I don't know if he's just violating what God told him to do, or if that was understood as saying, back off and don't do anything, but that he would still be able to discuss the matter with Jacob. I don't know exactly what the prohibition was, but it is very clear to Laban that he's under divine protection. That much is being clarified. Gary?
In our time, to do the things that Jacob had done, he could have been easily charged with embezzlement. And that's exactly what these people were thinking.
Yeah.
And that's why they pursued him so hard.
Yeah.
They robbed us. They stole us from us.
Yeah.
Even our sisters are gone.
Yeah. Yeah. Made away with the whole family, made away with some of our stuff, and with our inheritance. Even if that was rightly bargained out, that's not how they're perceiving this, really. So, as Laban begins speaking to Jacob, he's going to air out every perceived outrage and mention all of these things that would sound like crimes that Jacob has committed. we know the story differently, of course, but he focuses on several things. You know, that they've done it secretly. You carried away my daughters like captives, taken with the sword. He's forgetting that he's the one with the actual army, and that the daughters wanted to go with Jacob. There's just a lot of half facts and loose playing with the truth and everything that Laban says. Jacob's key takeaway from this, I think, would be revealed in what happens in verse 29. Laban says, "It's in my power to do you harm, but the God of your father spoke to me last night, saying, 'Be careful that you speak to Jacob, neither good nor bad.'" What's Jacob going to take away from that? See, I was right. God's still with me. I'm still in the right here, because God is even coming to my enemy and saying, "You need to back away." This feels like it would give Jacob every confidence in the world to speak for himself and to stand on his own feet and just tell Laban exactly what has happened and what he's intending to do, and really not worry too much about the fallout. God is still on his side. So, in particular, Laban says many things that Jacob could have gone through that speech and disassembled it point by point and taken out the red pen and said, "No, here you're wrong on this. This was a dumb thing to say. No, that's a lie. This didn't actually happen." Could have really taken this thing apart. But he focuses on one when Laban says, as if it wasn't good enough that you took all of my animals and took my daughters and everything, you took my gods. You even took all my little idols that I had sitting around. And Jacob really focuses in on that at first to say, now hold on this, because I didn't do that. Yeah, wait a minute. This didn't actually happen. Jacob doesn't seem to know that Rachel has taken those. So you have a kind of a tense moment, because Jacob says, if you find those, you go and search our camp. If you find them, we'll kill on the spot whoever took them, because you're not going to find them here. We think, okay, he's going to find those with Rachel, and they're going to have some dramatic thing. I mention it being near satirical, or maybe intended that way. I think it very well could be, because of how Rachel ends up getting out of this. She puts them in the camel cushion and is going to sit on them. And then when her dad comes by and is saying, "Look, we're searching the stuff, get up, let me get through here," or whatever, she says, "Sorry, I can't," and provides the reasoning. She's having her woman's time. She's menstruating. She can't do that because she's in discomfort and is having that time. And so you have a depiction which is in line with a lot of what the Bible does, and just kind of heaping scorn on these idols and making them out to look foolish and weak and impotent and just dishonored in every possible way. So you're getting the image of a woman in her period sitting on top of these idols. And that's kind of what you're supposed to think of the worth of those idols. It's just kind of brought to the forefront. Whatever is going on there, they do end up getting out of it. And so Jacob then can feel justified in saying, "See, you didn't find him anywhere. What were you going on about?" Then he really is going to launch into his attack, his counterattack against Laban, and really read him the riot act, telling him everything that has gone on and everything that he's suffered through. A lot of it is just recounting what he said to his wives beforehand. The main credit is given, once again, to God in a term that is rarely used. It's only used, in fact, here in chapter 31 in the Bible. He refers to God as the fear of Isaac, or the terror of Isaac, is how he describes Jehovah in this case. A really interesting name for God that we won't have time to get into too much, but regardless of why that name is used, it's who he's clearly giving credit to for everything that has happened. And this is just reiterating everything that we've seen before. God has been with him. Beginning in verse 43, we'll have to do that next week, but it's a pretty straightforward little section there where we're going to see essentially the creation of a national border. You have kind of a treaty, a peace covenant that takes place, and it's really phrased as being a border between two peoples, between two nations. This is continuing to chart the growth of Israel as a people, as a nation. You had Abraham come into the land with nothing. He starts gaining wealth. He starts gaining animals. He eventually buys land. He eventually has children here. You eventually have people buried here. You have people start recognizing them as a mightier people of their own. And now, by this point, you've got territory. You've got a boundary, a border that would be fitting for a nation. All right, we're going to finish there. Pick up in chapter 31, verse 43 next week. Thanks so much for your time. Really do appreciate it as always.